It was the night that everyone had been waiting for. The stage was set, the cameras were rolling, and the audience could feel the anticipation in the air. Jimmy Kimmel had spent years hosting one of the most popular late-night talk shows in the country, building a reputation for his wit, his charm, and his ability to turn political moments into moments of pure entertainment. Tonight, however, was going to be different. Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary under President Donald Trump, was set to appear as a guest on Jimmy Kimmel Live. It was her first time on the show and no one knew what to expect. Karoline was no stranger to controversy. She had become the face of the Trump administration's messaging, defending the president's policies and actions with unflinching confidence. Whether it was handling questions from the press or dealing with heated exchanges with political opponents, she had shown a resilience that made her stand out. And now, she was about to face the sharp-tongued Jimmy Kimmel, known for his ability to throw curveballs that even the most seasoned politicians struggled to dodge. The night began as any other, with Jimmy Kimmel warming up the crowd, cracking jokes, and getting the audience in the mood for some lighthearted fun. But this wasn't going to be an ordinary interview. The stakes were high, and Jimmy had prepared for this moment like no other. As Karoline made her way onto the stage, the audience erupted into applause. She smiled, waved, and took a seat beside Kimmel, who was already grinning with anticipation. "Karoline, thank you for joining us tonight," Jimmy began, his usual playful tone at the ready. "I have to say, you're the last person I expected to see sitting on this couch. You've been keeping quite a busy schedule over at the White House, haven't you?" Karoline, dressed in a sharp, navy blue suit, looked poised and confident. She nodded, her expression steady as she prepared herself for the night ahead. "It's great to be here, Jimmy. I'm always happy to make time for a good conversation." But Jimmy wasn't about to let her off easy. He leaned in, a mischievous glint in his eyes, and asked, "So, Karoline, you've become the face of the Trump administration. You've been handling some of the most difficult press conferences in history. But how do you really feel when you get thrown under the bus by your own team? You know, like when President Trump goes off script and makes your job even harder." The audience gasped, sensing that this wasn't going to be a simple Q&A. Karoline, however, didn't flinch. She had been through tougher questions before, and she was ready to take on whatever Kimmel threw her way. "Well, Jimmy," Karoline began, her voice calm but assertive, "I think it's important to remember that the president speaks his mind. That's one of the things that sets him apart from the typical politicians you see. He doesn't filter his thoughts. He speaks directly to the American people, and I'm there to make sure the message is clear." Jimmy smirked, clearly amused. "So, you're the filter then? You're the one who takes the heat when things go off the rails?" Karoline gave a small laugh, unbothered by the line of questioning. "I'm the one who makes sure the message is clear and that the facts are presented accurately. It's a tough job, but someone has to do it." The audience was intrigued, sensing a clash of personalities unfolding before their eyes. But Kimmel wasn't finished. He had one more question up his sleeve, and it was about to turn the entire conversation on its head. "Okay, Karoline, let's talk about something that's been on everyone's mind," Jimmy said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "The president's response to the pandemic has been controversial, to say the least. How do you, as his press secretary, feel about all the criticism he's received over his handling of the situation?" Karoline's expression remained calm, though it was clear that she had anticipated this line of questioning. She knew that Kimmel wasn't pulling any punches tonight, and she was ready to counter whatever he threw her way. "The president has always been focused on the economy and getting America back to work," she explained. "Of course, the pandemic has been a challenge for everyone, but we've been working hard to ensure that the American people are supported and that we're doing everything we can to mitigate the impact of the virus." The audience seemed to accept her response, though there were murmurs of disagreement in the crowd. Jimmy, however, wasn't done. He pressed further, aiming for something more explosive. "And what about the recent spike in cases, Karoline? You know, when the president suggested that maybe people should just drink bleach. How do you defend that?" The room fell silent. Karoline's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. She had anticipated tough questions, but this one was a personal attack on the president's intelligence and judgment. She didn't respond immediately, allowing the silence to hang in the air. The tension between her and Jimmy was palpable, and the audience waited with bated breath for her reaction. Then, without warning, Karoline's face broke into a small, confident smile. Well, Jimmy, I think it's important to take everything in context. The president was speaking off the cuff, and of course, we all know that sometimes things are said in a moment of frustration. But the president's actions speak for themselves. He's done more for this country than any of his critics would like to admit. The audience's murmurs grew louder as Karoline spoke, and Jimmy Kimmel could sense the shift in energy. Karoline Leavitt was no ordinary guest. She wasn't there to laugh at her own expense or play into the usual late-night jokes. She was a seasoned political figure, sharp and composed, used to the heat and fully prepared to give as good as she got. Jimmy, however, wasn't about to let her slide with a simple response. He leaned forward, his eyes glinting with the gleam of a man who knew exactly how to push someone's buttons. "So, Karoline," Jimmy continued, his voice thick with sarcasm, "you're saying that when the president talks about injecting bleach into your system, we should just chalk it up to his unique way of thinking? Is that the official line?" The crowd was at the edge of their seats now, captivated by the back and forth. Karoline didn't hesitate. Her response came swiftly, like a well-placed counterpunch. "Jimmy, I think it's safe to say that the president's words were misinterpreted. He was being sarcastic, and it's unfortunate that some chose to take them out of context. But let's be real here, what matters is that President Trump has prioritized the health and safety of Americans from the very beginning. We've worked tirelessly to secure vaccines, personal protective equipment, and financial support for the American people." There was a slight edge to Karoline's voice now, a subtle sign that she wasn't about to let Kimmel or anyone else undermine the president's accomplishments. But Jimmy wasn't backing down. He smiled wider, sensing the growing tension, and decided to hit below the belt. "Well, Karoline, let's not forget that while you're busy talking about priorities, the president has made a lot of people question whether he's really putting America first or just his own ego. Just last week, he was busy hosting rallies while the pandemic raged on. Don't you think his actions have spoken louder than his words?" The atmosphere in the studio shifted. There was no denying that Jimmy had struck a nerve. Karoline's face remained impassive, but a flicker of something darker passed through her eyes. She took a deep breath, tightening her grip on the armrest. "Jimmy," she began, her voice steady but firm, "I'm not here to defend every single thing the president does, but let's not forget what he's accomplished. We've rebuilt the economy, brought unemployment to record lows, and even managed to push through historic tax cuts. I'm not saying everything has been perfect, but President Trump has delivered on his promises." Kimmel scoffed, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. Okay, Karoline, I hear you. But what about the American people who feel forgotten? The ones who see the rallies and the divisive rhetoric and think, why hasn't the president done more for us? What do you say to them?" Karoline paused, her eyes narrowing just slightly. This was it. This was the moment where things could either take a turn for the worse or she could use it to her advantage. She wasn't about to let Jimmy's playful jabs turn into a full-on attack. She'd been in press briefings with far more aggressive reporters, and she was not going to lose control of this moment. "The president has always fought for the forgotten American," Karoline said, her tone unyielding. "He's been focused on issues that matter to everyday citizens, whether it's job creation, lowering taxes, or fighting back against unfair trade practices. The president doesn't just talk about change, he makes it happen." For a moment, the room fell silent. Kimmel sat back, eyes fixed on Karoline as if weighing her words. The tension was thick in the air, and the audience could sense something was about to break. They had seen Kimmel take down powerful figures before, but there was something different about this interview. Karoline wasn't backing down. She wasn't cracking under pressure. In fact, she was starting to hold her own, maybe even more so than anyone could have anticipated. "Okay, Karoline," Jimmy said, his voice taking on a playful tone again. "You're clearly not backing down, and that's impressive. But let's change gears a bit. What about some of the more controversial actions of the president? For example, his relationship with foreign leaders. You know, some people have said that he's too cozy with dictators. What's your take on that?" Karoline exhaled slowly, mentally bracing herself for the question. She had been asked about the president's foreign relations many times before, and she had always been prepared with an answer. But Jimmy Kimmel wasn't just asking for policy, it was clear he wanted something more, something personal. "The president has always prioritized American interests when dealing with foreign leaders," Karoline said confidently. "It's not about being cozy with anyone. It's about making deals that benefit the United States. Look at the work he's done with North Korea, China, and Russia. He's been unafraid to challenge the status quo and stand up for America. We need a leader who isn't afraid to play hardball. Kimmel raised an eyebrow as if skeptical. So, you're saying it's okay for the president to be friendly with leaders who have been called out for human rights abuses, as long as it benefits the U.S.? There was an audible gasp from the audience. The question hit hard, and for a moment Karoline seemed to pause. This was a question she knew was coming, but that didn't make it any easier to answer. Karoline's eyes locked with Jimmy's, her gaze unwavering. I'm saying that sometimes tough decisions have to be made for the greater good. The president's job is to protect the American people, and if that means engaging with difficult foreign leaders to secure peace, trade deals, or security, then that's what he'll do. Kimmel leaned forward again, sensing the turning point. He could feel the tension building to a boiling point, but he had one more question. One question that could change everything. All right, Karoline, he said with a sly grin. Let's talk about your future. With all the talk of 2024, do you think you'll continue working for the president? Or do you have your eyes set on something else? Maybe running for office yourself? The audience held their breath. It was a question that could set the stage for the night's most explosive moment yet. The question lingered in the air like a high-stakes game of poker. Karoline Leavitt's face remained calm, but her mind was racing. Jimmy Kimmel had just thrown a curveball, and the audience could feel the shift. They had been expecting her to defend the president, talk about her work, maybe even make light of the usual political banter that came with such late-night appearances. But now Kimmel had posed a question that hit closer to home. What about Karoline's future? Karoline took a moment, her fingers lightly tapping the armrest of her chair as she considered her response. She had never been one to shy away from a challenge, and she wasn't about to start now. With a slight tilt of her head, she locked eyes with Kimmel, her expression a mix of amusement and determination. Well, Jimmy, she began, her voice steady but laced with a hint of defiance, I'm focused on doing my job right now. I'm proud of the work I've done as press secretary, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to serve this administration. But as for the future, I'm not one to rule anything out. The audience seemed to hold its breath, waiting for more. Kimmel, sensing the tension, leaned in, raising an eyebrow. Not one to rule anything out, huh? He repeated, his voice dripping with curiosity. So, you're not saying no to politics in the future? Maybe a run for Congress? Or even, dare I say it, a higher office? Karoline's lips curled into a small, confident smile. I'm not going to speculate on that, Jimmy. Right now, my focus is on being the best press secretary I can be. The president needs a strong communicator, someone who can handle the heat, and that's what I'm doing. As for the future, we'll see what happens. The audience seemed to nod along with her answer, though some were undoubtedly skeptical. They had seen many politicians play the same game, deflecting direct questions with vague answers. But Karoline's calm, collected demeanor made it clear that she wasn't afraid of the spotlight, she was ready to take it on headfirst, no matter where it led. Jimmy, however, wasn't ready to let her off the hook just yet. He leaned back in his chair, a mischievous smile creeping onto his face. Well, Karoline, I think we're getting somewhere. But let's not forget you didn't exactly answer my question. You're saying that you might consider running for office one day. I mean, let's be honest, you've got the political chops. You've been on the front lines of some of the most heated political battles in modern history. What makes you think you couldn't handle it? The crowd was intrigued now. Some were nodding along, others whispering amongst themselves. They all knew that Karoline Leavitt was a rising star in the world of politics, and the idea of her running for office was not as far-fetched as it once might have seemed. Karoline's smile remained unwavering as she responded. It's not about handling the spotlight, Jimmy. It's about doing what's right for the American people. If I ever decide to run for office, it will be because I truly believe I can make a difference. But I'm not in a rush. I'm focused on the job at hand. At this point, Jimmy Kimmel could sense he had taken the interview in a new direction. The playful banter was slowly turning into a more serious discussion, one that was drawing in the audience and giving them a glimpse into Karoline's resolve. Kimmel, being the master of his craft, decided to go for the kill shot, something that would break the tension and bring the conversation back to the heart of the matter. So, Karoline, Kimmel said, now lowering his voice slightly, let's talk about that heat you're taking. It's not just from me, but from everyone. Critics have been calling out your administration for its divisiveness, its handling of protests, and even the way the president has engaged with the media. How do you respond to those who say that you and the entire administration have contributed to the country's growing divide? The room fell silent. For a moment, even the audience seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Karoline's response. This wasn't just a political question, it was a personal one. The media and the public had been increasingly vocal about the divide in America, and Karoline had often been at the center of it all. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was the moment she had prepared for, the one where she could either falter or rise to the challenge. "Jimmy, I've said this before, and I'll say it again," Karoline began, her voice clear and unwavering. "The president has always been a champion for all Americans, and I don't think anyone can argue with the progress we've made. Yes, there are challenges, there always are, but I truly believe that America is stronger than ever. We've built the economy, lowered taxes, and brought jobs back. People are seeing results, and that's what matters." Kimmel wasn't satisfied with that response. He pressed further, his voice rising with intensity. "But Karoline, the divisiveness is still there. The country feels more fractured than ever. Can't you see that?" Karoline's gaze hardened, and for the first time that night, there was a hint of emotion in her voice. "I don't deny that we're living in a time of great division. But it's not just the president who's been blamed for it, it's a culture of division that has been building for years. We can't keep pointing fingers and expecting change. We need to come together as a country and work toward solutions." The audience was on the edge of their seats, sensing that the tension was at its peak. They had come for entertainment, but they were getting something much deeper, a clash of ideals, a battle of wills. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just defending the president's actions, she was defending the very fabric of America itself. Jimmy, realizing he wasn't going to get the confrontation he had hoped for, gave a small nod of acknowledgement. All right, he said, his tone lightening slightly. "I see what you're saying, Karoline. But let's lighten things up for a second. Let's talk about something more fun. You've been in the spotlight for so long, do you ever just want to take a break and do something completely different? Like, I don't know, maybe host your own late-night show." The audience chuckled, sensing the shift back to familiar territory. But Karoline wasn't done yet. She wasn't ready to let Jimmy off the hook just yet. Karoline Leavitt wasn't about to let Jimmy Kimmel's playful jab slide. She had been patient, strategic, and, up until that moment, composed. But now, with the question about hosting her own late-night show, something in her shifted. She had been asked about the president, the country, and even her own future, but this question about entertainment felt like an attempt to sideline her political stance. Karoline wasn't just another guest on a talk show. She was here to make a statement. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly as she met Jimmy's gaze. There was a fire in her now, and the audience could feel it. The playful mood was gone. She wasn't going to let Jimmy's casual tone steer the conversation in a direction that distracted from the issues she cared about. "Well, Jimmy," Karoline said, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. But there was an unmistakable sharpness in her voice. "If I were to host a late-night show, it wouldn't just be jokes and laughs. We'd actually get into the real issues, the ones that matter. I'd make sure to bring on guests who can talk about the real challenges facing this country. And I wouldn't just sit there and let them dodge tough questions either." The audience erupted into applause, some clapping enthusiastically, others clearly impressed by her candid response. Jimmy's smile faltered for a second, and he raised his hands in mock surrender, realizing he wasn't going to get the easy, lighthearted response he was expecting. Okay, I get it," he said, chuckling nervously. "You'd make a great host, Karoline. But let's be real for a second. You've got your hands full as the White House press secretary. You've got a lot on your plate. And the country is divided. The media, the protests, the political gridlock. How do you deal with it all?" There was a beat of silence as Karoline looked directly at Jimmy, her expression becoming more reflective. The audience was still, sensing the depth of the moment. This was no longer about defending her boss or playing the political game. Karoline was speaking from a place of experience and resolve. "I deal with it by focusing on what I can control," Karoline replied, her voice quiet but firm. "It's not always easy. There are days when I wonder how we got here, how the discourse in this country became so fractured. But I also know that I'm doing something that matters. I'm working for a president who believes in the American people, who wants to make their lives better. My job is to communicate that message even when it's hard, even when people don't always want to hear it." The sincerity in her voice struck a chord with the audience. This wasn't the usual political rhetoric they were accustomed to hearing. This was a woman who had seen the worst of the political machine up close, who had been on the front lines of the most contentious period in modern American politics. She wasn't just talking about policy or the president's agenda, she was talking about the weight of her responsibility, the emotional toll of trying to bridge a divide that seemed impossible to fix. Jimmy's face softened for a moment, and he gave her a nod of acknowledgement. He had tried to rattle her to get a rise out of her, but Karoline had stayed composed, and in doing so, she had won the crowd. But Jimmy wasn't finished. He had one more trick up his sleeve, something that would test her resolve even further. "Well, Karoline," Jimmy said, his tone changing to something a bit more serious, "you've been a great sport tonight, and I've got to admit, I'm impressed by your composure. But I've got to ask, can you really keep up this level of intensity? With everything going on, with the criticism, the back and forth, the constant media circus, is it really sustainable? Or will the pressure eventually break even someone like you?" The question hung in the air, and the tension in the studio skyrocketed. The audience had been with Karoline up until this point, but now they were holding their breath, wondering how she would respond to the question that many had been dying to ask. Could she really keep going under the immense pressure, the endless scrutiny? Or would the weight of it all eventually cause her to crack? For a moment, Karoline didn't speak. She just sat there, looking at Jimmy with a calm that seemed almost unsettling. The clock ticked on, and the silence stretched long enough for the audience to feel the gravity of the moment. Then, Karoline spoke, her voice steady and powerful. "The pressure is part of the job, Jimmy. It's always been there. It's not new. I didn't come into this role expecting it to be easy. If anything, I knew it would be one of the toughest jobs in the country. But I also know this, I believe in what I'm doing. I believe in the work we're doing in this administration, and I believe in the people we're helping. That's what keeps me going. The minute I stop believing in that, that's when it becomes unsustainable. But right now, I'm more committed than ever." Her words hit hard, and the room fell silent once again. There was no mistaking the conviction in her voice. Karoline wasn't just talking about holding a job in the White House, she was talking about something far deeper, a mission to restore America's strength and integrity. And whether the country agreed with her or not, Karoline Leavitt had a vision for the future that was driving her forward. Jimmy Kimmel, sensing he had pushed as far as he could, gave her a nod of respect. "All right, Karoline," he said, his voice softer now. "I think we've reached the point where we can both agree on one thing. You've got one of the toughest jobs in America right now. And whether we agree or disagree on things, I think we can all agree that you're doing it with strength and conviction." The audience, which had been on the edge of their seats, finally erupted into applause. It wasn't the kind of applause that comes from a funny punchline or a well-timed joke. This was different. This was genuine respect for the intensity, the passion, and the resilience Karoline had shown throughout the interview. But as the applause died down, Karoline's face hardened again. She had come into this interview with a goal, to hold her ground, to stand up for the president, and to prove that she could handle the pressure of the job. But there was one last thing she needed to do, something that would solidify her place in this moment. And she was about to deliver it in an unforgettable way. The studio was still buzzing from the previous exchange. The applause had died down, but the atmosphere remained charged with tension. Karoline Leavitt had just proven her mettle. She had stood her ground against one of the most skilled late-night hosts, answered his tough questions with confidence, and walked away from the interview with her integrity intact. But as the cameras panned over the audience, a sudden, unexpected energy began to build. Jimmy Kimmel, ever the opportunist, knew that the tension had reached its peak, and he wasn't about to let it slide into a predictable ending. His mind was working quickly. This was the moment where he could either let Karoline leave with a win or make it unforgettable. He was about to throw a final curveball, one last question that could turn the entire evening on its head. "Well, Karoline," Jimmy said, leaning forward with a glint in his eye, "you've talked about the pressures of the job, the criticisms, the constant battles. But here's the million-dollar question, one I think the audience really wants to know. How long can you keep up this tough guy image? How long before it cracks? People don't expect someone like you to last." The question on everyone's lips is, when will the real Karoline Leavitt finally come out? The words hung in the air. The audience, who had been riding the wave of excitement and tension, seemed to pause. Was Kimmel about to cross a line? Was he going to push Karoline into an emotional response, the kind that might make her falter and reveal a weakness? For a moment, Karoline didn't move. She sat still, her gaze locked on Jimmy, who was now sitting back in his chair, a slight smirk on his face. He was testing her, but this wasn't just about her job as press secretary anymore. This was personal. He had just thrown a grenade into the conversation, and he was waiting to see if she would explode. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Jimmy's playful tone had shifted into something far more serious, far more intense. Karoline could feel the weight of the question pressing down on her. This wasn't about policy or the president anymore. This was about her, a woman with a fierce determination to succeed, but also a human being capable of breaking under the weight of it all. But Karoline wasn't about to let Jimmy have the last word. She wasn't going to allow him to paint her into a corner with his question. She had been through worse, much worse than this. The challenges she had faced in the political arena had been more daunting, more dangerous than any late-night host's snide remarks. She wasn't some political puppet for the audience to mock. She was here because she believed in the mission she was part of, and no amount of pressure or scrutiny was going to change that. With a slow, deliberate movement, Karoline stood up, her expression unwavering. The audience held its breath, unsure of what was coming. For a split second, the room was frozen, like a chessboard before the final, game-changing move. Jimmy Kimmel looked up at her, his eyes wide, unsure of what to expect. Without saying a word, Karoline took a few steps forward, closing the distance between herself and Jimmy's desk. The audience murmured, sensing that something big was about to happen. The tension was palpable. Jimmy, ever the host, adjusted his posture, trying to regain control of the situation. Karoline, But before he could finish, Karoline interrupted him with a sharp gesture. Jimmy, she said, her voice calm but filled with intensity, you think I can't handle this? You think I'll break under pressure? The room went silent. Jimmy was momentarily taken aback, his smirk fading as he realized the weight of her words. No, Karoline continued, her tone never wavering. I'm not here for the jokes. I'm not here to play the part of the punching bag for the audience's amusement. I'm here because I believe in something. And as long as I have a seat at the table, I'm going to use my voice to stand up for what I believe is right, no matter how hard it gets. The audience sat in stunned silence. They had expected a punchline, a quick retort, or even an emotional outburst. But Karoline had just given them something far more powerful. She had shown them the true depth of her conviction. Jimmy sat back in his chair, momentarily speechless. The cameras zoomed in on Karoline, who now stood tall, her posture proud and resolute. The audience could feel the shift, the energy in the room had completely changed. They weren't just watching a political interview anymore. They were witnessing something far more profound. This wasn't a game. This was real. Jimmy, now humbled by the force of her words, looked at Karoline with a mixture of respect and awe. Well, Karoline, he said, his voice quieter now, I think we've just witnessed something pretty incredible here tonight. You've definitely made your mark. Karoline smiled, but it wasn't a triumphant smile, it was the smile of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. Thank you, Jimmy, she said, her voice steady, but this is just the beginning. The audience erupted into applause, this time more fervently than before. They weren't clapping just for the performance, for the back and forth they had witnessed. They were applauding Karoline for her strength, for her ability to stand tall in the face of the most intense scrutiny, for her refusal to let anyone define her. As Karoline walked off the stage, her head held high, she knew this moment would be remembered. Jimmy Kimmel had tried to break her, to push her into a corner, but she had turned the tables. She hadn't just survived the interview, she had owned it. It was, without a doubt, the most epic live TV moment in recent memory. And Karoline Leavitt had just proven that she was more than up to the challenge.